Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. In conversations about polarized political issues, phrases like "it's not about race, it's about class" have become the perfect way to induce a stalemate. It seems as though the traditional materialist critique of inequality has been supplanted by a fast-evolving set of reflections of group identity. Mainstream politics makes fast and loose assumptions about the relationship between class and identity, and between economic conditions and culture. These assumptions are arguably a key contributor to the culture wars. In The Identity Myth, David Swift covers the 4 different kinds of identity most susceptible to rhetorical and cultural manipulation: class, race, sex, and age. He considers how the boundaries of identities are policed and how diverse versions of the same identity can be deployed to different ends. Ultimately, it is not that identities are simply more complex than they appear, but that there are more important commonalities. David Swift is a historian and writer who specializes in the history and contemporary politics of the British left. He is the author of A Left for Itself, and he writes about the state of the left for The Times, the Fabian Review, and The Critic, among others. I'm very happy that David joins me now to discuss the identity myth. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome.
David, I normally try to conceal my first question, which is essentially for the guest to introduce themselves to do my job for me. With you, I think it's going to be very ad hominem to start with, because on the cover of your book, we have 4 blocks: class, race, sex, and age. So maybe I'll ask you to define yourself by those parameters, given that these are the questions we're going to be addressing.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah. So in terms of, class is an interesting one, isn't it? I definitely consider myself middle class, absolutely. I don't think that's really in dispute. In terms of race, I'd say, well, again, race doesn't really exist, does it? So I think maybe ethnicity is a technique. I know it's on the front of my book, but I think I prefer to say ethnically and white British.
Right.
I suppose actually, like a lot of people from Liverpool, where I'm from, I've got a sort of Irish Catholic background. Grandparents, great grandparents were Irish, but I definitely wouldn't consider myself white Irish, on the census form. Yeah, I suppose gender, I'm male. Was it sex or gender? I forgot. Look at it now.
Well,
In gender,
we'll get to this.
So yeah, sex, I'm male, and in terms of youth or generation, this is an interesting one. So I'm currently 34 years old, but I wouldn't like to put myself into a kind of generation, right? Because I think, as is argued in the book, often this kind of idea of millennials or Gen Zers or whatever is a load of nonsense in some cases. It's not really based on any real criteria.
Okay, well, so far I'm getting evasive out of this first answer, but I guess
At
there's
least.
reason to all of this. So just to introduce listeners to what happens in the book, we've already pointed to class, race, sex, and age as the 4 categories of identity, or things that contribute to constructions of identity that you try to tackle and dispute to a certain extent in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this book is a little bit unusual for the kind of material that we deal on the network with usually, in as much as you take a whole bunch of perspectives and bring them together to try to define a problem without necessarily getting too much into any of the details. I wanted to ask you why you wrote the book and who it is for, and why you think the arguments that we're going to get into need to be brought together, and for what reason.
So, the reason I wrote the book is that across these different kinds of identity categories, like class and race, etc., obviously the discussion of these issues is becoming more and more prominent. And I also think that the kinds of material issues which affect class, race, gender, generation, etc., are again becoming more pressing and more prominent today. But I think very often in sort of discussion of these identities, be it in academia, in the mainstream media, from businesses and politicians of both left and right, increasingly there's this focus on a sort of politico-cultural identity, which apparently certain groups have, or which can be imposed on them, which is increasingly not only, I think, divorced from the actual material conditions of the group itself, but I think can be increasingly used and misused for all kinds of purposes, right? Be it to sell cans of Pepsi, or to win general elections, or whatever, advance careers and secure research funding. And so that's what really made me, or motivated me, to write the book, right? To look at how this works according to different forms of identity and examine the discrepancy, if there is this discrepancy between the political, cultural assumptions about certain groups and the material realities. In terms of who it's for, and why I think why I'm doing it and putting it together in this way,
Mm.
is I think some of the kinds of arguments you might see, are sometimes heard on the right, from people on the right, um, who say, "Oh, never mind, bloody identity politics, etc." And that's certainly not what I'm trying to do. And I think this more left-wing critique of identity politics, needs to happen and needs a voice. But also, I think I'm departing from other more traditional, old school left, maybe even like
Hmm.
Marxist-inspired critiques of identity politics, which really focus on class. I think sometimes to the exclusion of other important
Yeah.
intersections and material realities. So I really think that there's a room for a book like this, which is based on academic research, some of my own and mostly of other scholars, but is written in a more accessible language, for your average non-academic
Mm.
reader who's interested in nonfiction. And yeah, it is not aimed actually just at an academic audience, but is aimed at a more general reader who might be interested in these things. And I think also, yeah, I'm trying as hard as I can to not be too particularly partisan one way or the other. So I look at sort of right-wing politicians and left-wing politicians. I look at different kinds of journalists, and yeah, I think I think there's a need for many people, um, such as myself, if you like, who are sort of liberal left
Mm.
socialist types, to read this kind of thing, which can interrogate, maybe hopefully anyway, interrogate some of our assumptions around identity.
Yeah, and I think you go quite far in making that point and trying to explain some of the trade-offs. I'll tell you the thing that came to mind just as I was reading a book, and something I've been preoccupied with recently. In many conversations that I've had over the last couple of years, usually conversations with people who are critical of the left, but pertain to the left in one way or another, there's this kind of phrase that pops up in various different forms. The phrase is, oh, it's not race, it's class. It's not sexuality or gender, it's class. And this kind of almost started feeling like a deflection of a certain type of materialist argument from one category of consideration into another. And the more I started thinking about this, I realized that this is almost a kind of a hollow deflection, and it is indeed, as you already intimated, a kind of deflection that the political right quite often uses to completely dissolve any conversation of any problem. So, if we're talking about trans rights, quite quickly someone is going to be saying, "Oh, but this completely ignores the conversation about the working class," and therein the conversation ends. And I guess what your book is trying to do, and I really admire the effort given how difficult this really quickly becomes, is to go and tackle all these different markers of identity one after another. And I guess to try to play them off the kind of material interests of the categories that you define.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. The idea that, oh, it's not race, it's class, or it's not sexuality, it's class. Obviously, these things are inextricably linked, right? So,
Mm,
if you are, say, a poor black person, then obviously you're more likely to be exposed to the kinds of negative things that black people can be exposed to in Britain or the US than somebody who's
mm,
obviously, very rich and well-to-do. Likewise, talking about trans rights and violence against trans people, the overwhelming amount of violence committed against trans people is committed against trans sex workers. And
yeah,
particularly it happens in South America and Brazil for some reason that I'm not aware of really. So actually, if you're a trans person, your likelihood of being subject to attack and intimidation and all the rest of it is massively linked to class, obviously.
yeah,
So these things are inextricably linked. And definitely, what I'm not trying to do is say, oh, actually, it's all about just wealth and income. No, of course not.
mm,
But what I'm trying to do, I mean, the famous case which created the idea of intersectionality, I think General Motors in Detroit in the late
yeah,
60s. And, in this case, you have, and this is a brilliant example of the material intersections of, say, class and race and gender, whereby if you're black, you can't work in the office. And if you're a woman, you can't work on the shop floor, right, in the engineering bit. So therefore, if you're a black woman, you can't work anywhere, right? And that
yeah,
brilliantly shows how it's not about identity, it's about the literal biological fact of being a black woman means you can't get a job there. Now, people then couldn't say to the office manager at General Motors, "Oh, I may look black, but I actually identify with white concepts such as accurate timekeeping and the nuclear family.
mm,
So fix me a desk, honky." this is what I'm talking about, right? So we've gone from a consideration of, okay, what is the material reality of that person, right? How are they discriminated against? How do they suffer in different ways based on indelible things about them? To this idea that, we're focusing on this idea of black identity, which is about stuff like not caring so much about timekeeping, not
Yeah.
being too keen on objective truth and reality. I mean, this is at the more egregious end of the spectrum, but this was we do see this kind of stuff published by fairly respectable institutions. You might
Mhm.
remember from last year, the Smithsonian Museum published this thing on white characteristics, which included stuff like punctuality and objective truth and stuff like this.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that you expect in right-wing memes, and it suddenly turns up in kind of liberal institutions as though it was somehow
Yeah,
an
exactly.
acknowledged truth. Yeah.
And you got to think, how is that helping anyone, right? So, and you got to think, so therefore, what's the point? Where does it come from? Like, what's
Mm.
driving this desire to, set out this sort of black identity and white identity, and so this is a lot what the book's about.
So you just described this kind of endless trade-offs in which we're supposed to be contending, given that your book is driven by this intersectional analysis. Even the word intersectionality doesn't really appear so much in the book. And I want to take us tiny bit away from this kind of consideration, because I've kind of put it to you that you're still more interested in class than in anything else. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because out of all the identity markers that we have considered so far, it's class that seems to me, at least, to be in the greatest amount of crisis. So I just want to park this question of kind of where we end up overall, because that's the kind of political project that I think we need to unpack a little bit in the course of a conversation. But I want us to get to a conversation about class. So at that point at which we have agreed, oh, it's not necessarily about race, it's not about gender, it's about class, we find already a dead end. I was struck in particular about how, in trying to define classes, particularly the working classes, you quite often resorted to this kind of negation technique. Like, you define the working class almost through a set of observation of what the working class isn't. Where are we with class? Why is this such a taboo?
Yeah, I mean, a few reasons. I think on the one hand, you have the reality of economic changes and changes to the kinds of jobs that people do, etc. Changes to the ownership of property, massive inflation of property prices and houses and all the rest of it, and uh, changes to how actually age is, the biggest thing about property ownership rather than traditional concepts of class.
Mhm.
On the one hand, we've got the shifting economics of the past couple of decades, which has really disrupted so much of our, traditional understanding of class, and quite appropriately too. But then I'd say also, aside from the very serious and important and interesting fact that the whole sort of economic basis of class from, say, the 19th or 20th century is
Mhm.
completely slipping away, we also have the idea that, oh, if you're talking about class, you're talking about this, a sort of racialized, and not only racialized, but also I think like a sort of culturally specific sense of the quote
Yeah.
white working class. I mean, I think for various reasons, the left over the past few decades has been talking less about class, and I think in some ways, that's completely reasonable. But I think especially since people like Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, since they have started talking about class, I think the left this has created this awkward thing on the left then, because if you are then a left winger who makes arguments which might seem in any
Mhm.
way similar to what Tucker Carlson or Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson saying, then obviously that's very difficult, right? So that makes it much more
Yeah.
awkward if you're on the left, because if you are on the left and you want to talk about class, perhaps it does seem as though you're doing it in the kind of racialized, essentialized way that, say, right-wing politicians increasingly invoke class, which of course is devoid of nuance and is absolutely saying, this is what the quote homogenous block of the working class is. So I think that's a problem as well. Actually, I think that's a problem that if you want to talk about class from the left, you've got to be very careful to not sound as though you're sort of homogenizing people and stuff. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important is that this is something that's unchanging, right? So right now, for example, in the UK, certainly in the US as well, in other countries, whereby you have this great generation or increasingly generational disparity of wealth, whereby younger people increasingly can't afford to buy houses and so on and so forth. Lots of older people who were not particularly well off when they were able to buy their house decades ago are
Mhm.
now simply by, still owning the house, have all kinds of property wealth. So increasingly, I think people want to talk more about generation rather than class, right? Whether it be
Yeah.
in terms of determining how people vote, or how they make sense of the world, how they identify together, or even actually about sort of class in the sense to say, our traditional understanding is no longer good. It's actually about, home ownership and student debt and stuff like that. And I think on the one, there's to some extent that trend is powered by the changing economic realities. However, I can't help but think that to some extent it's powered by a desire to just get away from the awkward fact that a lot of
Yeah.
people who we would traditionally consider to be working class seem to be moving towards the right politically. And I don't think the left really wants to talk about that. And I think sometimes an easy way around that really is to say, a lot of these so-called working class people, newly voting conservative or Republican, very often they own their own home, and
Mm.
actually they don't have any student debt to pay down. So actually, isn't this, a master's graduate paying a ridiculous rent in Brooklyn or London or wherever, paying off his student loan as well? Isn't that person, the real working class now? I think, well, not really.
Yeah.
But in many cases, a lot of time when their grandparents die and their parents die, a lot of these penniless 30, 40 something, postgraduates are going to inherit a great deal, actually. And, this kind of familial wealth, which is amassed over,
Yeah.
generations, is going to continue to amass, actually. It's just that people are living longer, which is making it seem more generational than about class. But I think for all these kinds of reasons, then I think there is maybe either an awkwardness on the left talking about class, and maybe a failure to see how much it is still at the bottom or at the root of so many of these other identity divisions and disputes.
I think this is going to be one of the most important takeaways from the book. And I think it's also something that I see in a lot of discourse in the kind of post-left circles that I hang out with. We seem to have driven ourselves into this completely dead end, or painted ourselves in the corner. I'm mixing very simple metaphors here. But this whole conceptualization of the university trained cognitive worker, quite often actually an academic or an artist,
Mm,
with this is the spheres in which I operate, as somehow the working class, as pertaining of the working class, and therefore being able to represent the working classes, and therefore wanting to be the beneficiary of any working class adjacent politics, is incredibly troubling. And one of the things that I think it does, that you do observe in your book, this kind of complete miscategorization of what is the middle class, cognitively at the very least, is the papering over of the fact that classes are defined by contrasts and by resentment. And this is something, a bit of Marxist analysis that we, I think, really need to get back to. So one of the things that really came to mind as I was reading your book is that they're the kind of people that you and me might be affiliated with, the middle classes that might make some pretensions to leftist politics in one level or another, actually paper over the fact that we have to despise the working classes because this is how we define ourselves. And I use despise in very, very inverted commas
mm,
now, but I'm not sure whether a Marxist would necessarily need those inverted commas.
mm.
So maybe we could dwell a little bit on the tension that's both cultural and material between those classes, and maybe try to find some kind of sympathy for the politics of the middle classes.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? You might remember if, in England a few years ago, MP Emily Thornberry at the time, I think Shadow
Hmm.
Home Secretary, so and she was campaigning by election down in Kent, and she tweeted this photo of a house bedecked in England, national flags, right, for
Yeah.
England. I think it was during the World Cup or European Football Championship. So
Mm.
the house was bedecked in England flags, and she just the caption was simply, seen in Rochester or something like that. That's all she
Yeah.
said, I think, stuff like that.
So this is
And
a
obviously,
Labour politician, and I think one of the other piquant ideas was that there was a white van, a working class,
oh yeah, exactly, yeah, the Wi-Fi,
his
exactly.
insignia of a working class livelihood in the van, and
Indeed, indeed. Now, and obviously, and incredibly stupid, terrible thing to tweet. I mean, who thinks, oh, I'm a Labour front bench politician with thousands. Oh, I'll just point this, and no one's gonna, And it's one of those things where it's particularly damaging for the left, I think, because it seems to not just malevolent actors who don't like the left, but also maybe shifting people who might still vote Labour think, oh, it's the mask has slipped. This is what they really think of us. It's one of these moments that we've seen in sort of Western politics over the past couple of decades. Another one of them was Bigotgate back in 2010 when Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister Gordon
Hmm.
Brown, on a hot mic after he'd been talking to this woman about immigration, said, "Oh, she's this terrible, bigoted woman." And again, irrespective of whatever you think of the woman's views, she was just not, I wouldn't necessarily say bigoted, but certainly, anti-immigration, I'd say.
Hmm.
But anyway, whatever you think of their views, it's almost like the mask is slipped. This is what they really think of us, kind of thing. So Emily Thornberry resigned or was fired from Ed Miliband's shadow cabinet, and Ed Miliband issued this grovelling apology and stuff. But then this is why I'm bringing this up. So he was asked, what do you think when you see an England flag? And then he just paused a bit and went, proud or something. And I remember thinking at the time, because as aghast I was with Thornberry's behaviour, and not so much,
Hmm.
was he not shocked that that's how she thinks, but shocked that she would do it and post it and all this. But of course, I was thinking to myself, you know, I'm no more likely to fly the Cross of St George during a football tournament than I am to have, I don't know what I'd say, a burning cross on my door, or even just a cross, an unburning. You know
Oh,
what I mean? This is what
we
I'm saying.
went to extremes very quickly.
This is what I'm saying. There's just no way I would do such a thing, right? And hardly anyone I know would do so. And this is the thing, right? Would hardly anyone in the Parliamentary Labour Party, or indeed anyone working in left-wing magazines or think tanks, or how many academics would do something like this? And again, I think this might be a particularly English thing as well, right? So obviously, in somewhere like America or France, it's less problematic. I mean, I was just
Hmm.
recently looking at Jean-Luc Mélenchon's campaigning attire and stuff. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've seen it, but he's always got this tricolor sash on, and
Yeah.
this is the hard left candidate, by the way. So obviously, it's not a problem in some countries, but for your English or British left-wing middle class academic, journalist, activist, etc., the idea that you would, be seen dead with national. I mean, you look at the criticism that Keir Starmer gets now. When he deliberately does his conferences, photo ops, etc., with Union Jack flags behind him, gets attacked online by a certain kind of leftist. But of course, it's not as though Keir Starmer would necessarily, it's not as though you can imagine Keir Starmer like getting the barbecue out and a few beers and an England flag hanging. I can't imagine. No.
I mean,
And this is the
he is being investigated by the police now precisely
oh
for
yeah, I
for
mean, but
drinking beer
he's definitely
during the
having a beer. Yeah,
pandemic. But
exactly.
that might be
Yeah,
a
I can definitely
diversion.
imagine having a beer. Yeah, barbecue
Yeah.
or curry, as it turns out, absolutely, but not an England flag, at least not spontaneously.
This is a super interesting moment because we're talking about symbolism. The idea that the left would somehow find it dirty that the working classes could be invested in patriotism. That's somehow unimaginable. And I think that is papering over this whole lack of comprehension for the fact that voters, different classes, different identity characteristics might actually hold different political views. So Emily Thornberry might have thought working class Nazi thug. This is kind of vaguely what she might have
Mm,
meant by that. Gordon Brown fed bigoted anti-immigration woman. But the amount of contempt that these positions betray for the fact that someone might disagree with a leftist politics, the one only righteous politics. I've had so many conversations with leftist friends over the issue of Brexit, for instance, where
mm,
the very idea that someone who was university educated and sort of inhabiting the art world or journalistic spheres could possibly be pro-Brexit, that was just anathema. What is the idea of the working class that's acceptable to the politically engaged classes? And why is that really politically useless?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I'd say so. There was this moment around 2016 with obviously Brexit and Trump, etc., when briefly I think there was more of a space in academia, in regular left-wing media, and even online on social media for more of this kind of okay, can we talk a bit more about class now? And then very soon after, you had the sort of backlash, which was actually, I think you'll find that Trump voters were better off on average. And actually, I think you'll
Hmm.
find it was the middle classes of the home counties who caused Brexit. Now, as I go into in the book, there's all kinds of material arguments there about the material background of Trump voters versus Clinton voters and Brexit voters, whatever. So I'm not here to talk about that now. But the point was that they couldn't even consider it. So quickly
Hmm.
did this backlash come. We couldn't even have a brief period of oh, actually, let's talk about like working class attitudes to immigration. We're not saying okay one thing or the other, but let's talk. No, actually, it's how dare you say working class people are more against immigration? That's
Yeah.
classist. So quickly that kind of backlash came, and I think it's false. And I think I talk about in the book. There's what I talk about in the book is the difference between authenticrats, which is a phrase I borrow from
Hmm.
Joe Kennedy, and exonerators, which is one I've made up of myself. And the authenticrat argument, and this was put forward by Joe Kennedy a couple of years after Brexit, Trump, etc. And he was saying exactly this. He was saying, oh, actually, it's patronizing to think that working class people are more skeptical of immigration or, postmodernist thought or,
Mm.
the latest food trends from the continent or something. I think you'll find, and okay, there's something there, right? At its seed, there's something interesting there, which is okay. Yeah, we should have more nuance and understanding of these things, which of course I'm trying to talk about in the book. But fundamentally, is this massive overcorrection, which is so politically ineffective, and it's doing it, I think, simply because they can't stand the idea that people whom they are meant to respect and put on a pedestal and meant to be fighting for, the quote unquote working class, they can't accept that they might have ideas around limiting immigration because limiting
Mm.
immigration is not seen as a legitimate political aim in the same way that raising or cutting taxes or spending is. It's seen as bigoted. It's seen as literal racism, literally,
Yeah.
literal fascism. And this is, I think, is absolutely mad because I, for example, would like to go and work in the United States or Australia or wherever, but I accept that they have the right, to have an immigration policy, whether to take me
Mm.
in or not, and obviously, okay, I completely understand
You
why
do
certain
realize
countries.
that this makes you a member of the alt-right, essentially. That statement alone is enough. The idea that migration sovereignty
Oh,
of a country could be held up as an ideal is already in many
I mean,
academic
that's
circles
that's
completely taboo.
well, indeed, yeah, and I should say personally, I don't care. It's like my personal views. You know what I mean? So I don't live in the UK now. Nearly all of my friends are immigrants, and by that I don't mean, I'm one
Mm.
of these people. Oh, my friends are immigrants. No, I mean nearly all of my friends from the UK, from Liverpool, from university, etc., live outside of the UK, are immigrants somewhere else. As
Yeah.
am I. My wife is an immigrant, etc. But I'm very, very typical of my sort of background and class and generation, all the rest of it, in that I've lived and worked all over the world, etc. So for me personally, it's not as though I personally am obsessed with borders and stuff like this. But bloody
Yeah.
hell, most people are. This is it. This is the whole thing that we are. If you are uh, you know, uh, academics and people who are very interested in politics and people who are engaged with literature, shall we say, and stuff like that, who read lots of
Mm.
books. We are unusual people, and we need to appreciate how unusual we are. And again, just to finish this point, it's really important that we don't think that these kinds of views around, say, just regulating immigration, say, not necessarily limiting it, but just regulating it, right, not having open
Mm.
borders, is a particularly like a white thing or even like an old thing. And of course, Black, Asian people, all different ethnicities of people have support for regulated immigration, both of their own countries that they live in and of other countries to which they might like to emigrate one day.
Yeah.
It's not it's certainly not specific to a certain kind of person. So yeah, this is the idea. I think it's very important for those of us on the left to appreciate how unusual we can be on certain positions, and that's not to
Mm.
endorse those alternative positions necessarily. It's just to say, look, all different kinds of people hold these positions. If we don't like them, how are we going to persuade them to think otherwise? But in order to even start with that, we need to accept that they hold these positions in the first place.
Well, that's the very depressing point that your book, I think, makes through and through. This the left's assumption or rather the liberal consensus that certain positions are acceptable, and these are the only ways that we imagine the electorate can be conceptualized and constituted. But maybe the last question I have to do with class, even though this is a topic I have a feeling we could talk for quite a lot longer. You write the book from a perspective, or rather with the experience of having seen a whole bunch of years in electoral successes with the working classes, however we have just defined them, for a whole bunch of politically right programs, whether it's Trump, whether it's maybe the Conservative Party in the UK. And of course, we've seen near victory in France for Marine Le Pen. So, if we were to take kind of a flight over the electoral contract between the working classes and those different representation of the right, what is happening there that might be instructive and useful for the left to absorb as a lesson?
I mean, interestingly, I suppose it shows that you don't necessarily. I think it shows that you don't necessarily have to actually be offering much of material benefits to win people's votes.
Mm,
Although definitely, I'm not suggesting the left should do that, right? I think people so often are fed up, especially if you've been traditionally voting Labour or Democratic and things aren't getting better for you, or you voted for the Socialist Party or another party in France and things aren't getting better for you. Then maybe why not just try something else out of desperation? So I think definitely the left has to offer concrete material stuff, especially if, I think it's going to be the case, Boris Johnson's plans of levelling up the UK and making the UK a more fairer society economy. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to see any, serious changes there. So I think at the next general election, you're going to have a lot of very angry, depressed people who have maybe voted for Brexit, hoping that might change something, and then
mm,
maybe a vote Conservative, or possibly for the first time in their life, maybe hoping that might change something. Why not? If they've had a Labour MP for decades, let's
yeah.
go with a Tory. And I think that a lot of these people are going to find that actually nothing's got better since Brexit or since they elected Boris Johnson. In fact, considering inflation, the cost of living crisis, things have gotten a lot worse. So I definitely think you're going to have a lot of
Mm,
angry people there, a lot of depressed people. The real problem is that they just won't vote. A lot of these people, a lot of people voted for the first time at the Brexit referendum, and many of them might not vote again since.
mm.
And I think sometimes it's, sorry to just come back to what we were talking about before, but I
Sure.
think already I can hear certain voices on the left saying, why do we privilege certain kinds of voters? Okay, so these may be more low information voters, less likely to turn out, who did turn out for Brexit. Why do we care so much about them? These red wall seats that went Tory for the first time. Why do we care so much about them? What about so many other voters, like young people and immigrants and stuff in the south, and postgraduates who can't pay off the student debt? These are all legitimate, valid people. Why don't we listen to them? And I think one reason is that a lot of these people already vote, and
Mm,
very often they already vote for the left, and their allegiance isn't really being contested right now. Whereas, some of those former people, so-called, white working class and all the rest, a lot of these people either they do not vote or their allegiance is absolutely, is still in the balance and could go one way or the other. So I think one thing that the success of right wing politicians, be it Le Pen, Farage, Trump, etc., has had in winning over working class support is that very often, I suppose, it shows that if you get the rhetoric and the language and the culture right, you don't actually have to have much literal material
mm.
promises, if you like, or policies or tangible stuff to offer them if you can get all that right. But of course, I think that would be a huge mistake for the left. I mean, the left definitely has to get the language and the culture and the rhetoric right, but it also has to have some very tangible, meaningful things. Like, vote for us and we'll give you this. Because, as I
Yeah.
say, I think there's going to be a lot of disillusioned voters over the next few years.
Yeah, and I think that's where the geographical spread of your interests and your studies in the book comes in quite handy, because I have a feeling that one could quite easily demonstrate that in the US, for instance, this kind of disenchantment with the material non-delivery is already beginning to be a problem. After the Biden victory, we're a couple of years in, and it's already looking quite shaky. But I think we are going to have to keep on moving on the blocks on your cover, and we're going to have to move a little bit towards race. We're moving into a territory where there is no lack of political motivations. People are motivated to get out and vote and to organize. We have certainly seen with the focus and the rise of Black Lives Matter and the repercussions of George Floyd's murder around the world, we have seen, I think, a rise in discourse around race that in the street rather than academic discourse and in journalism that has not been present for quite a while. And at the risk of spoiling your book for readers, you argue that this is not necessarily the kind of godsend for the left that one would imagine. That to kind of go with the knee jerk of black equals left is a very, very
Absolutely.
big mistake.
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of what's happened over the past year or so, I think, it's been a very American centric. And even though obviously it's spread around the world and you have all kinds of BLM protests everywhere, again, I think that they're very much using the rhetoric and the imagery of US race relations discourse and so on. And I think that is not very helpful for all the various scenarios which are nothing like the US. So
Mm.
if we're talking about race in the planet, then we need to obviously look at not just a global perspective, but how it functions in different ways in different contexts, right? So race in say South Africa, or say a mostly black country like Mozambique, or somebody else somewhere else like Australia, for example. These are completely different contexts. Brazil, India. These are countries with hundreds and hundreds of millions of people of diverse ethnicities and backgrounds, and the sort of one size fits all, literally black and white attitude to race, which I think we see coming from America, is absolutely not appropriate really for anywhere apart from America. And I also think that, and we're seeing this in the US already at the last election, and it's only going to become more problematic for the left, I think, in the future, is that large numbers of so-called people of color are moving away from their traditional left-wing,
Mm.
democratic allegiances and moving towards the right. I think the only ethnic group that Trump didn't improve his vote share amongst between 2016 and 2020 was white people. I think everyone else, like Native
Mm.
Americans, Asian and Pacific Islanders in particular, Hispanics in particular, even Black people, he improved a few percentage points. There's a journalist in the UK, Tamima Olawale,
Oh,
who has wrote an article recently in which he borrowed, shall I generously say, a lot from my book,
I
and he
have
was
noticed
talking
this. I have a link to his article
of.
in on my notes. I was going to ask you
Yeah,
about the very thing.
well,
Go on.
indeed, yeah. It's because
Mm.
he certainly mentions a fair few things that I mentioned in the book,
Mm.
and a quick reference would have been nice, but whatever. Anyway, so and he's talking about the increasing, if we look at the religiosity of the UK, we look at the future of, say, Christianity in the UK. It's I mean, dominated by immigrants, and especially immigrants from the continent of Africa. You know, these are really complicated issues, and so often on the left, the idea is that there's this great crusade in which all of the so-called working class people, all of the women, all of the trans people, all of the gay people, all of the disabled people for some reason, we're all on one side in some
Mm.
great crusade, and this is obviously complete nonsense, and it's very dangerous thinking. And as Western societies become more demographically diverse over the next few decades, sometimes some people on the left almost think, okay, we just need to wait. We just need to wait. Demography is on our side. I think it absolutely is not. And I think in
No.
the same way we've seen so much of the so-called, what quote unquote white working class going over to the Republicans and Conservatives in the past few years and decades. Wait until this happens with, firstly Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, and British Indians, as it's happening now, British African people, people from African background, and then eventually African Americans. Sounds ridiculous, but it's happened with
Mm.
white working class. Eventually British Muslims and so So absolutely, we can see increasingly diverse societies where. I mean, I've said this in my previous book as well. My biggest fear is that Britain and America ends up like Israel, where you have this tiny
Mm.
marginalized left, which is supported almost exclusively by white people, Ashkenazi people, like the whites of Israel.
Yeah.
Like, everyone's got at least a master's degree. We all live. We're all mostly young hipsters who live in big cities, and that's the left. Meanwhile,
I
so
mean,
in
the
Israel,
podcast industrial complex is very happy in this scenario. We can keep on having this
it must be.
conversation forever.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, this is my thing. I think demographics is definitely not some kind of get out of
Mm.
jail free card for the left, and I think the left needs to actually take a long hard look at the politics of different groups.
Mm.
And it just people like say AOC in the United States is completely unrepresentative of young Hispanic women
Yeah.
even, and yet of course she's held up as this is what young Hispanic women are like, and I think that's a big problem.
Mm. You frame your argument about race and ethnicity through the lens of neocolonialism, which I guess most listeners will be able to figure out a little bit where we're talking about. But I'm interested in particular in how you perceive this neo-colonial impulse that drives from Frantz Fanon and onwards in your analysis, how that can be applied to a very specific set of situations. So, as I mentioned, the book does change geographic focus from one point to another. And in as much as we talked about the UK mostly when it came to class, the conversation about race really has to bounce a little bit further, and it has to
Hmm.
be rooted in what against rather what was happening in the US. Particularly in the UK, though, I'm interested in how you perceive these neocolonial, post-colonial, whichever one of these terms we apply, how you see these attitudes playing out in the very kind of peculiar or very sui generis racial mix of the UK. And now I'm not going to try to explain to our non-UK listeners what it is that happens in the UK, but it is quite simply to say we are not the US.
Yeah.
How do you make useful the kind of international globalist material that you draw on into a very particular local political situation? Because I think that's what you are trying to do in the book. You know, we're not trying to solve race relations globally. This is in the end a
Mm.
book that has applications in a very particular set of politics.
Yeah. So I'm trying to, I think when I talk about sort of race relations in this sense in the book, or maybe the intersection between like ethnicity and politics and identity and all the rest of it, I talk about, yeah, both the sort of macro global level and also within the UK and some other countries. I think one big issue is on the macro global level, the shifting sort of power structures, where obviously we've seen the rise of China and India, etc., and the relative decline of Western Europe and North America. I assume that's going to continue apace over the next few decades. Already, it looks as though, it looks as though India was having a very bad pandemic for a couple of years, and looks as though it's going to
Mm,
cost a lot of growth. Now, actually, it looks as though India is going to be pretty well placed over the next couple of years, for various reasons. And in the however 4 million people, 1.5 billion, sorry, however many people there are in India, their concepts of race is obviously completely different to how we in the UK see, for example.
hmm
And this is going to become a huge issue as obviously likes of India and Brazil, for that matter, Indonesia, for example, Turkey already is doing. As these countries improve in their or increase their geopolitical clout, that's obviously going to change how we understand race and discuss around race and that sort of white centric or Eurocentric way it's often discussed. And then within particular countries, again, the sort of changing racial demographics of the UK, uh, absolutely, as people's views change, of course, and it's not as though, say, if somebody has more conservative views on, say, LGBT issues or women's rights today, by no means will they in a few years. Absolutely. If you look at attitudes in general, of course, British
mm,
attitudes towards gay people were horrible in the 80s. All kinds of polls saying people with HIV deserve it. Shouldn't get any sympathy and all things, really incredible things that you wouldn't think had a majority or plurality of support 30 years ago. So just as attitudes to LGBT issues has shifted on a national level in the UK in 30 years, so too it can amongst individuals and particular groups and communities.
mm,
But in the short term, then obviously, ethnic diversity and increased immigration from all over the world will affect, attitudes towards religion, as I mentioned before, and LGBT people, and all kinds of different stuff as well. And I think, yeah, the left isn't necessarily prepared for that. I think it just associates blackness and brownness with goodness, and it associates goodness with being, pro climate, concerned about climate change and LGBT people and anti
mm.
nukes and anti royal family and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's in for a bit of a shock if it if it relies on a increasingly diverse country, I don't know, decreasing support for certain
Yeah.
issues, shall we say?
Well, I get that. That's the point at which I think there's another formulation of the left's problem that you've just arrived at when it becomes really visible, and that's to do with the fact that we can't just rely on any particular identity group to feel itself oppressed enough to be seeking the left as a political solution to its oppression. I mean, this is an age-old question, of course. I'm not proposing anything new here, but what doesn't, I think, get spoken enough about in the conversation that we're trying to address now is the difference between marginalization and oppression. And I think that will probably become very clear when we move on to the next category, which is sex or gender, depending on how we want to tackle it. And while it is quite clear that everyone can find examples of the oppression of Black people and the oppression of working classes,
Hmm.
these exist within living memories. But in the way that we talked about certain aspects of the middle class experience and how we talk about gender and sex and experience of age and generations, there comes a point at which it's no longer that easy to point to examples of oppressions. There's no longer a common enemy, which is why I think we get to the point where we have kind of intra-group fights. I mean, it's almost a conservative talking point, what I'm regurgitating now. We're talking about oppression Olympics. But I think there comes a point at which we have to start looking at pretty much every one of the identity markers that you outline through both the prisms of oppression and marginalization, quite simply because the groups that we are looking at have experiences of both to different degrees. How do we deal with all these identities playing themselves against one another when we are still stuck in a paradigm where there is some benefit to be gained by everyone and anyone from presenting themselves as just that 1% more disadvantaged than the previous group that had its focus? Now, without litigating any of this, which I guess we sort of are, how do we catch this impulse away? Someone has to at some point give up their position at the leaderboard, and I'm slightly pessimistic, I'm afraid.
No, well, I mean, I think definitely you're not cynical, and I think you're not being cynical at all when you say this is how this sort of thing actually works out. And just because oppression Olympics is a right wing term, but talking point, sorry, doesn't necessarily mean that this is often how people act. Like it's almost like top trumps. So I've got X, Y, and Z. I've got X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C too. So therefore, I think. And this is a real thing. This is, and especially people who are, say, middle class and white and heterosexual and all the rest of it. They think, oh, what can I be? And again, I think some of the, and I don't want to maybe anticipate stuff we're about to talk about, but certain things like the barrier for entry is so low, it's pretty easy. Now, race, okay, it's tough to change your race. And we've seen some people like Rachel Dolezal driven to it because, again, this distinction between what in her mind, the tremendous cultural kudos and clout of being black in her specific particular world.
Yeah.
And the pressure for her to, not just be a white woman. But that's fairly unusual. But indeed, if it's, again, to actually be gay, to be in a relationship with someone of the same sex, if you're not gay, it's a pretty big deal. But to say that you're queer, or I'm asexual, or I'm a bit kinky in the bedroom, anyone can do that. You know what I mean? You don't even have to do anything. You can be like a Laurie Penny, who is a British journalist and I think screenwriter. So she says she's genderqueer and all the rest of it. She is in a straight monogamous marriage with a man, right? A cisgender man. Right? She's a cisgender. What's queer about? There's nothing queer about a monogamous marriage between a man and a woman, right? So this is one thing. Oh, indeed, you can say, oh, I have autism, for example, or something like that. Okay, sure. Indeed, you may well do. But this is my point. It's sort of people do have this, or certain people do anyway, have this compulsion to almost like one-upmanship and to say, actually, just being yourself is enough. It's just enough. And I completely take your point. For a lot of these people, it is almost like, I used to have this space where it was me being talked about, and now it was black people or gay people or whatever, and I want to be me again. I think for a lot of women, for a lot of white straight women, the past few years have been very tough because for white straight men like myself, we don't get. It's not like I'm thinking, I'm privileged. I should be,
Well, you're from Liverpool. You always have that oppression card.
Oh, exactly. Well, that's my thing. Exactly. But yeah, and you know what? When we were putting together this book, the idea for the book, the publishers were saying, "Oh, I don't know, white straight man writing about these kinds of things." And like my agent told the other publisher went, "Oh yeah, but he's from Liverpool, so you can pretend to be dead working class, and then that's your thing, Yeah, and it's terrible the way that's how it is, by the way. But unfortunately, that's how it is. But anyway, so yeah, for a lot of middle class straight cisgender white women, it's been a tough few years for them because I'm sure that they do not feel particularly privileged. And indeed, white middle class straight women are not particularly privileged. They still have all kinds of problems, as we just see recently with the Supreme Court abortion ruling, and so many people saying, stop trying to say it particularly hurts black women or poor women or trans women or whatever. Just say it hurts women, because actually white middle class women are also going to suffer from this, just as they suffer from domestic violence and all the other things that affect white middle class heterosexual women. But I think a lot of them, they feel under pressure, right? Because they think it's no longer enough to be just a white, it's no longer enough even to be a lesbian. You're a lesbian, okay? Why aren't you trans? That's it. So I think for a lot of people, there is this pressure to this kind of identitarian one-upmanship. But I think it will end though, because this is particular people in a particular kind of world. If you speak to people who have little to no interest in politics, who do not work in academia, media, or certain very particular kinds of careers, they don't know a lot of this. They just don't know what's going on. Right
Mm.
now, that doesn't mean that they're unaffected or unaware of the broader, social justice trends of the past few years. No, I think it would be hard not to be, at least because the way, obviously corporations have very cynically taken up. But it's like, I know people from different kinds of backgrounds, different generations and ages and stuff like that, and they do not act or behave or think or vote the way that black people or Muslims or LGBT people are meant to, according to so many of the books I've read, the sort of milieu that I'm part of, think that they do. If that makes sense.
Mm.
So what gives me hope, and it's almost not to maybe
Go on.
paraphrase
Yeah,
George
there's one
Orwell.
good thing
Well,
so
I was
far.
going, but George Orwell, if there is hope, it lies in the proles, kind of thing. I think definitely, if there is hope, it lies in the the increasingly diverse society that we're a part of, and it's
Yeah.
becoming. I mean, if you look in the US now, there's been so much pushback from Hispanic Americans about the use of Latinx, or I don't know if that's how it's meant to be pronounced, or
I think
Latinx, or
Latinx
whatever
is
the
the
hell it's.
correct
Latinx.
term, but I'm just as bewildered by it as you
Well,
are.
indeed, and unfortunately, there are many prominent Hispanic, I think, journalists, politicians. There are left-wing Democratic Hispanic politicians,
Mm.
not AOC as far as I'm aware, but there are plenty of them saying this is nonsense. Not only is it
Yeah.
nonsense, not only do only 2% of Hispanic people would ever consider using that term,
Yeah.
actually, it can be counterproductive. So we're having a pushback simply from the reality of the fact that loads of Hispanic Americans saying, "What is this nonsense? Not in our name." If you look recently at the recall of of the San Francisco School Board, again, there's all
Mm.
kinds of complex stuff going on there. A lot of it will be to do with COVID and more
Yeah.
straightforward educational stuff. But of course, this is an extremely ethnically diverse, albeit probably not that economically diverse community,
Mm.
and very extremely left wing, of course. Not just democratic, but a particular kind of democratic, I assume, in San Francisco. And they're saying no. There's only so far we want you to go with. And we do want more parental oversight over exactly what our children are being taught about identity and stuff. And I think this is, I think just the reality of, because, so few gay people have this, queer identity in politics, which is
Mm.
somehow assumed that they nearly all do. So few black people and Asian people or Muslim people have this kind of radical identity in politics that some on the left assume they do. So I think the simple reality of people's real lives and politics and all the rest of it will hopefully, I'm hoping, act as some kind of anchor or dead weight to stop this sort of identitarian thing. Because
Mm.
yeah, I just think, I think as the material realities which gave rise to this kind of stuff in the first place is shifting, and as I mean, we're definitely going to see it in the UK over the next few years. When you have a great disparity between, say, Black Britons from an African background and Black Britons from a Caribbean background, I imagine the economic disparity
Yeah.
between those two groups is just going to shift over the next few decades. When you have, as you will see, I mean, as we already do in the UK, when you have so many Black and brown and female people in the cabinet, at the head of the executive, at the
Mm-hmm.
top of companies, when, as you will do soon, you have trans people in the cabinet, it's going to be increasingly hard to maintain this idea that being black or brown or trans or whatever
Yeah.
is this thing that certain kind of white person desperately wants to be. So, to answer your question, I think that's how this thing could be maybe lessened or resolved in the long
Okay. So you've just taken us into a hopeful direction, and that's to do with with time, with demographic changes. But I have a feeling in the last sections of your book, when you talk about age, about generations, I have a feeling that you don't really believe that Greta Thunberg is going to save us.
run. No, I'm not too confident about that actually. Yeah. Um, this is it. When we talk about young people, obviously the right, you can list the cliches, can't you? Oh, if they'd only saved and worked hard and didn't spend it on fripperies like avocado sandwiches and whatever, they could afford a
Mm.
deposit then for a house. And of course, on the left, you have this idea that young people are all these, left-wing radicals who are going to save the planet. And, even if you look in the UK, the vast majority of homophobic hate crimes are committed by teenagers and 20-year-olds. And okay, you might say that it's a
Hmm.
disproportionate amount of antisocial behavior committed by teenagers and 20s anyway. But okay, this is a big deal. Like, look at the world. If you think of India again, the world's second biggest country, and the BJP party is massively. I mean, it's popular in India anyway because it's
Hmm.
forms the government. It's particularly popular amongst young people. Even bloody Marine Le Pen. She has, I believe, far more support amongst young people in France than she does amongst over 65s.
Yeah.
Macron, again, Macron, it's reversed. Like his greatest support base is the older people, and the young people really don't like it. Now, again, I've seen this being written up as, oh, young people are turning their back on Macron centrism. Yeah, fair enough, it makes sense. But why are so many young people voting for bloody Marine Le Pen? Why aren't we talking about that?
Hmm.
So yeah, again, this is the idea that young people, millennials, Gen Zers, again, are this sort of homogenous block which is either going to save the world because of their activism and all the rest of it, or is actually just lay about to uh, you know snowflakes and all the rest of it. I think it's very similar. I think these are two sides of the same coin. Actually, the sort of essentializing of young people, which is unwarranted, basically.
Hmm, that's interesting. I mean, I had a counterpoint, but I realized as you were talking that this isn't really a counterpoint. But I was going to mention that the DSA, the Democratic Socialist of America, which could be, in principle, one of those organizations that is the future of the left, or at least a kind of critical aspect of the left, that seems to have over the last 10 years, the average age of membership of the DSA has changed from over 60 to somewhere in its 20s, which is potentially a thing of beauty. However,
Mm.
the same source in which I picked that gem up instructed me that one of the branches, one of the chapters of the DSA in Seattle, if I'm not wrong, has just decided to start spending a third of its income, a third of its dues, a third of its subscription fees on paying racial reparations. So it's completely changed its motto, its complete raison d'etre. It is now an anti-racist organization as opposed to a socialist worker-led organization. So I think these
Yeah.
these difficulties, these problems, kind of wrap themselves round around one another.
It'd be interesting to see what happens with this, the DSA, because again, okay, anti-racist organisation, but on whose behalf and for whom? Because okay, whilst there's plenty of
Mm.
black people who will completely endorse what they're doing and say, oh yeah, for us, eventually, I think the fact that the vast majority of African Americans want nothing to do with with that kind of thing, surely that will eventually make them realize, hang on, isn't this just some kind of white identity? It's like kind of cosplay,
Mm.
All right, we're not actually donning the fake tan and curly hair of Rachel Dolezal. But isn't this some kind of weird, like, racial? Again, you saw, I mean, you may have seen during the George Floyd protests a couple of years ago, in some egregious instances, there were these young white people flogging themselves and like
Oh,
licking the feet of black people.
oh God, I have a video that I am going to link in the episode notes that I think every white person needs to see. Like, those people were clearly high on acid and doing it, performing all of this entirely for themselves, chanting Black
Indeed,
Lives Matter
absolutely.
through nothing but narcissism. It's heartbreaking,
Indeed.
to see.
For now, I think it is feasible perhaps for these kinds of people to think, oh, maybe your average black person approves of this, and maybe we're getting
Mm.
closer to them, or we're doing what they might like for this. I think eventually that will become unsustainable. They will no longer be able to think that they are somehow doing this for black people, and it will become ever more apparent that they're doing it for themselves. So that's my sort of
Mm.
hopeful thing for the future.
Yeah.
Anyway.
With this message, what practical steps does one take? And I'm interested in particular about what it is that you do. You're a journalist, you have an academic background, but I'm interested in what it is that one might find as a recipe, as a kind of counter recipe to the political activism of your standard academic, intellectual, cognitive worker leftist. Because there's something that you're performing an act. You saturate a slightly broader audience that an academic analysis of the issues that you would take that would have taken on. You're reaching a broader audience. You're saturating them with a lot of information that's kind of quite a lot to take in, And for someone who hasn't figured these things out that profoundly, it is a crushing message. It does essentially tell you you've got a lot of these things wrong and you're not that special. But that aside, what do we want to propose to the academic, to the scholar, to the analyst, the activists engaged in actually dealing with the problems of identity politics?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in the book actually. I was saying, you can tell it's sort of when it was written because I'm saying Joe Biden seems to be, hopefully can show us a way through because obviously he was gonna like this old school New Deal, Democrat, and he was saying, right, I'm going to focus on money and material stuff, and he had a good start, didn't he, with the the coronavirus stimulus bill, and then of course he did get the bipartisan finance bill passed, I believe, and obviously Build Back Better stalled and so on. But and obviously now we have the inflation, all the rest of it, and his own problems there. But I think he had the right idea in that if you can turn on the taps of federal largesse, I think money in all kinds of places in academia. I think if the academic job market was much better as it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago, probably not great then, but better than it is now, then I think so much of the hate and rancor, so much of identity politics, you simply wouldn't have seen because so many of these people would have had decent, well-paid jobs instead. And frankly, if you have a decent, well-paid job, it's much harder. Not least because you don't have the time to be on the internet, on Twitter all the time, but also you have far less inclination to do so. Not just obviously in academia, but in all kinds of places. If there were better, more sustainable, long-term, steady jobs that were good for people's self-esteem on the left and the right, people being underemployed without the kind of job or income or status they commensurate with their education or what they think they should have, either because of their education or because of their white skin or whatever it is, on the left or the right, this idea that their status is under attack, so I'm going to take to the internet and abuse people online. I think that with money and resources, so much of this stuff would be less potent than it is now, I think. Again, that's obviously the most difficult thing in the world, isn't it, to find money for this? But I think better funded mental health services, more jobs in academia and politics, things like rent control, stuff like that, massive increase in housing supply. I think material changes, although they will be so hard to achieve, can hopefully maybe get us away out of this identitarian impasse. And what I would say to the left-wing academic and activist, etc., is you've got to get into power and actually try and change things. I remember sort of an acquaintance of mine who I saw at a wedding just before, in March 2020, just before the lockdown began. And he was an NHS doctor here in the UK. He was a former, probably current hipster, former ketamine addict in his addict in his 20s. I know when he was in his 20s, he used to love clubbing and ketamine and MDMA. NHS doctor, lives in London, hipster, skinny. This is the perfect Corbyn. This is homo Corbynist kind of guy. You can't think of a more typical modern Labour activist and voter. And even he was really moaning at me because this is only 4 months after the 2019 election when Labour's has this terrible defeat. Even he was moaning at me about Corbyn's attitude towards the Russian poisoning, and he was saying to me, if this guy wants to change our foreign policy and make us maybe more skeptical of, say, the US and NATO and whatever, you've got to get into power first. So why not just say, yes, the Russians did it? Why not at the cenotaph just sing gustily along to the national anthem? We know you don't support it, but just pretend so you can try like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen. This is what I'd say. So you've got to get into power somehow by hook or by crook, even if that does mean using the kinds of language or rhetoric that you might be a bit uncomfortable with or whatever. Get into power by hook or by crook, and then you can hopefully achieve things and achieve reforms which will bring about the sort of things that you want to see.
Hey, register to vote is the message, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, register to vote and vote. Yeah, that's something.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for the book.
Cheers.
Thank you for your time.
Cheers. Thank you. Nice to see you.
The Identity Myth: Why We Need to Embrace Our Differences to Beat Inequality by David Swift is published by Constable. I'm Pierre d'Alençon, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time.